Hermione Granger and the Chamber of Secrets. Chapter 9. The Writing on the Wall. What's going on here? What's going on? Attracted, no doubt, by Malfoy's shout, Argus Filch came shouldering his way through the crowd. Then he saw Mrs. Norris and fell back, clutching his face in horror. My cat! My cat! What happened to Mrs. Norris? He shrieked, and his popping eyes fell on Harry. You! He screeched. You've murdered my cat! You killed her! I'll kill you! Argus? Dumbledore had arrived on the scene, followed by a number of other teachers. In seconds, he had swept past Harry, Ron, and Hermione and detached Mrs. Norris from the torch bracket. Come with me, Argus, he said to Filch. You too, Mr. Potter, Mr. Weasley, Miss Granger. Hermione's whole body went cold with fear. It was as if all of the ghosts at Sir Nicholas' party had just floated through her. Even though they had done nothing wrong, all of the evidence was against them. They were going to get expelled. Suddenly, Lockhart stepped forward eagerly. Hermione couldn't help but gasp. She hadn't noticed he had arrived in her total shock and terror. Maybe there was hope yet. My office is nearest, headmaster. Just upstairs. Please feel free. Thank you, Gilderoy, said Dumbledore. The silent crowd parted to let them pass. Lockhart, looking excited and important, hurried after Dumbledore. So did Professors McGonagall and Snape. Hermione couldn't even feel her feet. They were numb with fear. As they entered Lockhart's darkened office, there was a flurry of movement across the walls. Despite the circumstance, Hermione felt her heart give a little flutter, knowing she was finally gaining access to Professor Lockhart's office. He gracefully glided to his desk and lit the candles. The amber flame danced across his chiseled face. Dumbledore laid Mrs. Norris on the polished surface and began to examine her. Hermione, Harry, and Ron exchanged tense looks and sank into chairs outside the pool of candlelight, watching. The tip of Dumbledore's long, crooked nose was barely an inch from Mrs. Norris' fur. He was looking at her closely through his half-moon spectacles, his long fingers gently prodding and poking. Professor McGonagall was bent almost as close, her eyes narrowed. Professor Snape loomed behind them, half in shadow, wearing a most peculiar expression. It was as though he was trying hard not to smile. And Lockhart was hovering around all of them, making suggestions. It was definitely a curse that killed her, probably the transmogrifian torture. I've seen it used many times. So unlucky I wasn't there. I know the very counter curse that would have saved her. Hermione knew that between Professor Lockhart, McGonagall, and Dumbledore, everything would be fixed. They would realize that she, Ron, and Harry hadn't done anything to the poor cat. Or at least that's what she was telling herself over and over as she tried to control her breathing. Hermione was having a tough time remaining calm and not just running at the mouth. She focused instead on Filch's dry, racking sobs, trying to take a breath every other hiccup. He was slumped in a chair by the desk, unable to look at Mrs. Norris, his face in his hands. Hermione's heart hurt for him, even through her anxiety. The poor man had no one but the mangy feline. Dumbledore was now muttering strange words under his breath and tapping Mrs. Norris with his wand, but nothing happened. She continued to look as though she had been recently stuffed. I remember something very similar happening in Ouagadougou, said Lockhart. A series of attacks. The full story is in my autobiography. I was able to provide the townsfolk with various amulets, which cleared the matter up at once. The photographs of Lockhart on the walls were all nodding in agreement as he talked. One of them had forgotten to remove his hairnet. At last, Dumbledore straightened up. "She's not dead, Argus," he said softly. Everyone looked at Dumbledore. "Not dead?" choked Filch, looking through his fingers at Mrs. Norris. "But why, she all stiff and frozen." "She has been petrified," said Dumbledore. "Ah, I thought so," said Lockhart, but no one but Hermione seemed to pay him any attention. Professor Dumbledore continued. "But how, I cannot say." "Ask him!" shrieked Filch, turning his blotched and tear-stained face to Harry. "No second ear could have done this," said Dumbledore firmly. Hermione let out a breath she hadn't even known she had been holding. "It would take dark magic of the most advanced." "He did it! He did it!" Filch spat, his pouchy face purpling. "You saw what he wrote on the wall. He found in my office. He knows I'm a... Filch's face worked horribly. "He knows I'm a squib," he finished. Hermione frowned. What was a squib? And how did Harry know Filch was one? "I never touched Mrs. Norris," Harry said loudly. "And I don't even know what a squib is." At least Hermione wasn't the only one. "Rubbish!" snarled Filch. "He saw my quick spell letter." "If I may speak, Headmaster," said Snape from the shadows. Hermione's heart started to pound again. Professor Snape hated Harry, and by proxy hated Hermione and Ron. Whatever he had to say probably wouldn't do well for their case for innocence. "Potter and his friends may have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said, a slight sneer curling his mouth as though he doubted it. "But we do have a set of suspicious circumstances here. Why was he in the upstairs corridor at all? Why wasn't he at the Halloween feast?" Harry, Ron, and Hermione all launched into an explanation about the Death Day party. Hermione's word vomit was finally good for something. "There were hundreds of ghosts. They will tell you we were there." "But why not join the feast afterward?" said Snape, his black eyes glittering in the candlelight. "Why go up to that corridor?" Ron and Hermione looked at Harry. She couldn't think of anything fast enough. Because, Harry shuddered. Hermione held her breath. "Because we were tired and wanted to go to bed," he said. "Without any supper?" said Snape, a triumphant smile flickering across his gaunt face. "I didn't think ghosts provided food fit for living people at their parties." "We weren't hungry," said Ron loudly as his stomach gave a huge rumble. Hermione grimaced while Snape's nasty smile widened. "I suggest, Headmaster, that Potter is not being entirely truthful," he said. "It might be a good idea if he were deprived of certain privileges until he is ready to tell us the whole story. I personally feel he should be taken off the Gryffindor Quidditch team until he is ready to be honest." "Really, Severus," said Professor McGonagall sharply, "I see no reason to stop the boy playing Quidditch. This cat wasn't hit over the head with a broomstick. There is no evidence at all that Potter has done anything wrong." "Innocent until proven guilty, Severus," Dumbledore said firmly. Snape looked furious, and so did Filch. "My cat has been petrified!" he shrieked, his eyes popping. "I want to see some punishment!" "We will be able to cure her, Argus," said Dumbledore patiently. "Professor Sprout recently managed to procure some mandrakes. As soon as they have reached their full size, I will have a potion made that will revive Mrs. Norris." "I'll make it," Lockhart butted in. "I must have done it 100 times. I could whip up a mandrake restorative draught in my sleep." "Excuse me," said Snape icily. "But I believe I'm the potion master at this school." There was a very awkward pause. "You may go," Dumbledore said to Harry, Ron, and Hermione. They went as quickly as they could without actually running. Hermione didn't allow herself to breathe until they walked out of Lockhart's office and down the hall. The breath she had been holding escaped her lips with such force she almost fell over. Her body was still tingling with terror. "Do you think I should have told them about that voice I heard?" came Harry's voice in the dark classroom. "No," said Ron without hesitation. "Hearing voices no one can hear isn't a good sign, even in the wizarding world." "You do believe me, don't you?" "Of course I do," said Ron quickly. Hermione was glad that Harry asked Ron and not her. She didn't know how she would have answered, or even if she could answer. She was still trying to breathe correctly. "But," Ron continued, "you must admit it's weird." "I know it's weird," said Harry. "The whole thing's weird. What was that writing on the wall about? The chamber has been open. What's that supposed to mean?" "You know, it rings a sort of bell," said Ron slowly. "I think someone told me a story about the Chamber of Secrets at Hogwarts once. Might have been Bill." "And what on earth is squib?" said Harry. To his surprise, Ron stifled a snigger. "Well, it's not funny, really. But as it's Filch," he said. "A squib is someone who was born into a wizarding family but hasn't got any magical powers. Kind of the opposite of muggle-born wizards. But squibs are quite unusual. If Filch is trying to learn magic from a quick spell course, I reckon he must be a squib. It would explain a lot, like why he hates students so much." Ron gave a satisfied smile. "He's bitter." A clock chimed somewhere. "Midnight," said Harry. "We'd better get to bed before Snape comes along and tries to frame us for something else." For a few days the school could talk of little else but the attack on Mrs. Norris. Filch kept it fresh in everyone's minds by pacing the spot where she had been attacked, as though he thought the attacker might come back. They had seen him scrubbing the message on the wall with Mrs. Scour's all-purpose magical mess remover, but to no effect. The words still gleamed as brightly as ever on the stone. When Filch wasn't guarding the scene of the crime, he was skulking red-eyed through the corridors, lunging out at unsuspecting students and trying to put them in detention for things like breathing loudly and looking happy. Hermione pitied him. Ginny Weasley seemed very disturbed by Mrs. Norris' fate. According to Ron, she was a great cat lover. "But you haven't really got to know Mrs. Norris," Ron told her bracingly. "Honestly, we're much better off without her." Ginny's lip trembled. "Stuff like this doesn't often happen at Hogwarts," Ron assured her. "They'll catch the maniac who did it and have him out of here in no time. I just hope he's got time to petrify Filch before he's expelled. I'm only joking," Ron added hastily as Ginny blanched and ran up to the girls' dormitory. Hermione followed her up the winding staircase. She passed the door to her own room and continued down the hall to where the first year's rooms were clustered together. Hermione realized with a sinking feeling she didn't know which room was Ginny's and chided herself for not visiting sooner. A noise to her right stopped Hermione in her tracks. It seemed to sound like soft crying. Hermione paused with her hand over the door handle and put her ear against the heavy oak door. Even through the door's weight, she could hear the cries a tad more clear, and they definitely sounded like Ginny's. Hermione was torn with indecision. She wanted to be there for Ginny, but also didn't want to be wrong and barge in on some poor first year. She took a breath. She was rarely wrong, and thought her odds were on her side. The heavy door swung open, and Hermione was met with a room similar to a hearse. 5 elegant beds arranged in a circle with walls of soft gold. Each student's trunk lay at the foot of each bed. Her eyes quickly scanned the room, and there, in the second bed clockwise from the door, was Ginny, laying face down on her bed. A dark leather book lay open next to her. "Ginny?" Hermione called quietly, not to startle her. It didn't work. Ginny jumped up immediately and shoved the book under her pillow. "Hermione," Ginny said, "what are you doing here?" "I just wanted to come to see if you're okay. We haven't been able to catch up lately," Hermione said, inching her way into the room. "I'm fine," Ginny said quickly. Hermione knew she was lying, but didn't want to push the issue. "Well, okay. I just wanted to check in on you. How have your classes been?" "They've been okay, I guess," Ginny said. Hermione perched herself on the corner of Ginny's trunk. "Learn any good jinxes lately?" From Ginny's letters, Hermione knew she had a particular affinity for hexes. She didn't blame Ginny. With that many brothers, hexes would be necessary. "I've been working on the knockback jinx with a few of the Hufflepuffs," Ginny said, crackling a smile. "And by working with them, I mean I'm using them as my guinea pigs." Hermione giggled, though inwardly cringed at the blatant breaking of the rules. She had a feeling Ginny didn't need to be reminded of the rules, like her brothers had to be. Ginny knew them, but still chose to ignore them. "So," Hermione said, changing the subject. She had been making it a point to be less judgmental with her friends, just like Parvati had said. "Gryffindor. I guess that wasn't much of a surprise, being a Weasley and all." "Actually, the hat couldn't make up his mind about what house it wanted to put me in," Ginny said. "Really? The same thing happened to me too," Hermione said. "But I didn't want to be in Ravenclaw either. I wanted to be in Professor McGonagall's house." "Oh, that's neat." An awkward silence fell over them. There were so many things Hermione wanted to say, but fought the urge. She could tell Ginny really didn't want to talk and had to respect that. "Okay, well, I'll leave you to get back to writing in your diary," Hermione said, standing up from the trunk. She tried not to take it personally when a relieved look crossed Ginny's face. "She's just worried about Mrs. Norris," Hermione told herself as she walked back down the spiral staircase to the Gryffindor common room. It was one thing to think it, but a totally different thing to believe it. Some habits were hard to quit. Hermione kept replaying the conversation with Ginny over and over and kept getting more and more upset. The only thing she found solace in were the thousands of pages of the books in the library. Thankfully, she had a clear subject to focus on and solve, the mysterious Chamber of Secrets, and threw herself into the task. Unfortunately, Hermione couldn't find what she was looking for, and getting more and more frustrated. With every page she turned that didn't contain the information, her anxiety rose. Hermione was able to breeze through a 3-foot-long composition on the medieval assembly of European wizards due for the following history of magic class with Professor Beans. She actually wrote 4 feet 7 inches and used the rest of the time in the library to continue her search. Harry and Ron had joined her, but were focused on the essay instead of her research. She emerged from one of the stacks, just as Harry measured his parchment. "All the copies of Hogwarts: A History have been taken out," she said, sitting down next to Harry and Ron. "And there's 2-week waiting list. I wish I hadn't left my copy at home, but I couldn't fit in my trunk with all the Lockhart books." "Why do you want it?" said Harry. The same reason everyone else wants it, said Hermione, to read up on the legend of the Chamber of Secrets. What's that? Said Harry quickly. That's it. I can't remember, said Hermione, biting her lip. And I can't find the story anywhere else. Hermione, let me read your composition, said Ron desperately, checking his watch. No, I won't, said Hermione. You've had 10 days to finish it. I only need another 2 inches. Come on. The bell rang. Ron and Hermione led the way to History of Magic, bickering. In the back of her mind, however, she knew she needed an answer about the Chamber of Secrets sooner rather than later, or else her anxiety would completely overwhelm her. For some reason unknown to Hermione, most of her classmates did not enjoy their History of Magic classes. Harry frequently complained about how boring Professor Beans was during his lessons, but Hermione just didn't see it. Professor Beans was their only ghost teacher. He had simply got up to teach one day and left his body behind him in an armchair in front of the staff room fire. His routine had not varied in the slightest since. Hermione took pleasure in knowing exactly what to expect in his classes. Professor Beans opened his notes and began to read today's lesson. Hermione, however, couldn't concentrate. The comfort she usually took on his monotone voice had been replaced with a dull hum that allowed the rest of her brain to tune out the lecture and instead obsess about the Chamber of Secrets. Hermione got more and more anxious by the minute. Finally, half hour into the lesson, she couldn't take it any longer. She put her hand up in the air. Professor Beans, glancing up in the middle of his lecture on the International Warlock Convention of 1289, looked amazed. Miss, Granger, Professor. I was wondering if you could tell us anything about the Chamber of Secrets, said Hermione in a clear voice. Dean Thomas, who had been sitting with his mouth hanging open, gazing out of the window, jerked out of his trance. Lavender Brown's head came off her arms, and Neville Longbottom's elbow slipped off his desk. Professor Beans blinked. My subject is history of magic, he said. I can deal with facts, Miss Granger, not myths and legends. He cleared his throat with a small noise like chalk snapping and continued. In September of that year, a subcommittee of Sardinian sorcerers, he stuttered to a halt. Hermione's hand was waving in the air again. She wasn't going to be brushed off this easily. Miss Grant? Please, sir, don't legends always have a basis in fact? Well, said Professor Bean slowly. Yes, one could argue that, I suppose. He peered at Hermione as though he had never seen a student properly before. However, the legend of which you speak is such a very sensational, even ludicrous tale. But the whole class was now hanging on Professor Bean's every word. He looked dimly at them all. Every face turned to his. Hermione could tell such an unusual show of interest completely threw him. Oh, very well, he said slowly. Let me see. The Chamber of Secrets. You all know, of course, that Hogwarts was found over 1,000 years ago. The precise date is uncertain. By the 4 greatest witches and wizards of the age. The 4 schoolhouses are named after them. Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin. They built this castle together, far from prying Muggle eyes, for it was an age where magic was feared by common people, and witches and wizards suffered much persecution. He paused, gazed blearily around the room, and continued. Hermione was at the edge of her seat. The story was slowly coming back to her. For a few years, the founders worked in harmony together, seeking out youngsters who showed signs of magic and bringing them to the castle to be educated. But then disagreements sprang up between them. A rift began to grow between Slytherin and the others. Slytherin wished to be more selective about the students admitted to Hogwarts. He believed that magical learning should be kept within all magical families. He disliked taking students of Muggle parentage, believing them to be untrustworthy. After a while, there was a serious argument on the subject between Slytherin and Gryffindor, and Slytherin left the school. Professor Beans paused again, pursing his lips, looking like a wrinkled old tortoise. Hermione's breath caught in her throat. Mudbloods, like her, like the one the hat warned. Reliable historical sources tell us this much, he said. But these honest facts have been obscured by the fanciful legends of the Chamber of Secrets. The story goes that Slytherin had built a hidden chamber in the castle, of which the other founders knew nothing. Slytherin, according to the legend, sealed the Chamber of Secrets so that none would be able to open it until his own true heir arrived at the school. The heir alone would be able to unseal the Chamber of Secrets, unleash the horror within, and use it to purge the school of all who were unworthy to study magic. There was a silence as he finished telling the story. There was unease in the air as everyone continued to watch him, hoping for more. Professor Binns looked faintly annoyed. The whole thing is iron nonsense, of course, he said. Naturally, the school has been searched for evidence of such a chamber many times by the most learned witches and wizards. It does not exist. A tale told to frighten the gullible. Hermione's hand was back in the air. She had more questions. Sir, what exactly do you mean by the horror within the chamber? There is believed to be some sort of monster which the heir of Slytherin alone can control, said Professor Beans in his dry, reedy voice. The class exchanged nervous looks. I tell you, the thing does not exist, said Professor Beans, shuffling his notes. There is no chamber and no monster. But, sir, said Seamus Finnegan, if the chamber can only be opened by Slytherin's true heir, no one else would be able to find it, would them? Nonsense so Flaherty, said Professor Beans in an aggravated tone. If a long succession of Hogwarts headmasters and headmistresses hadn't found a thing. But, Professor, piped up Parvati, you'd probably have to use dark magic to open it. Just because a wizard doesn't use dark magic doesn't mean he can't, Miss Pennyfeather, snapped Professor Beans. I repeat, if the likes of Dumbledore... But maybe you've got to be related to Slytherin, so Dumbledore couldn't, began Dean Thomas. But Professor Beans had had enough. That will do, he said sharply. It is a myth. It does not exist. There is not a shred of evidence that Slytherin ever built so much as a secret broom cupboard. I regret telling you such a foolish story. We will return, if you please, to history, to solid, believable, verifiable fact. And within 5 minutes, the class had sunk back into its usual torpor. Hermione, however, couldn't stop her thoughts from racing. I always knew Salazar Slytherin was a twisted old loony, Ron told Harry and Hermione as they fought their way through the teeming corridors at the end of the lesson to drop off their bags before dinner. But I never knew he started all this pure-blood stuff. I wouldn't be in his house if you paid me. Honestly, if the Sorting Hat had tried to put me in Slytherin, I would have got the train straight back home. Hermione nodded fervently. As they were shunted along in the crowd, Colin Creevey went past. Hiya, Harry. Hello, Colin, said Harry. Hermione had finally resigned to the fact that she didn't exist to Colin if Harry was around. Harry, a boy in my class has been saying you're... But Colin was so small he couldn't fight against the tide of people bearing him toward the great hall. They heard him squeak, "See you, Harry!" and he was gone. What's the boy in his class saying about you? Hermione wondered. That I'm Slytherin's heir, I expect, said Harry with a frown. People will believe anything, said Ron in disgust. The crowd thinned, and they were able to climb the next staircase without difficulty. Do you really think there's a chamber of secrets? Ron asked Hermione. I don't know, she said, frowning. Dumbledore couldn't cure Mrs. Norris, and that makes me think that whatever attacked her might not be, well, human. As she spoke, they turned the corner and found themselves at the end of the very corridor where the attack had happened. They stopped and looked. The scene was just as it had been that night, except that there was no stiff cat hanging from the torch bracket, and an empty chair stood against the wall, bearing the message, "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened." That's where Filch has been keeping guard, Ron muttered. They looked at each other. The corridor was deserted. Can't hurt to have a poke around, said Harry, dropping his bag and getting to his hands and knees so that he could crawl along, searching for clues. Hermione started to look around as well, even though she felt uneasy about poking around the scene of a crime. Movement near the window caught her eye. Scorch marks, he said, here and there. Come and look at this, said Hermione to Harry. This is funny. Harry got up and crossed to the window next to the message on the wall. Hermione pointed at the topmost pane, where around 20 spiders were scuttling, apparently fighting to get through a small crack. A long silvery thread was dangling like a rope, as though they had all climbed it in their hurry to get outside. Have you ever seen spiders act like that? Said Hermione wonderingly. No, said Harry. Have you, Ron? Ron? Ron was standing well back and seemed to be fighting the impulse to run. What's up? Said Harry. I don't like spiders, said Ron tensely. I never knew that, said Hermione, looking at Ron in surprise. You've used spiders in potions loads of times. I don't mind them dead, said Ron, who was carefully looking anywhere but at the window. I just don't like the way they move. Hermione giggled. She couldn't help it. She had never seen Ron so jumpy, and that, combined with her nervous energy, just gave her the worst case of the giggles. It's not funny, said Ron fiercely. If you must know, when I was 3, Fred turned my teddy bear into a great big filthy spider because I broke his toy broomstick. You wouldn't like them either if you'd been holding your bear and suddenly it had too many legs and... He broke off, shuddering. Hermione was still trying not to laugh as hard as she wanted to. Remember all that water on the floor? Where did that come from? Someone's mopped it up, Harry said, changing the subject. It was about here, said Ron, recovering enough to walk a few paces past Filch's chair and pointing. Level with his door. He reached for the brass doorknob, but suddenly withdrew his hand, as though he'd been burned. What's the matter? Said Harry. Can't go in there, said Ron gruffly. That's a girl's toilet. Oh, Ron, there won't be anyone in there, said Hermione, standing up and coming over. That's Moaning Myrtle's place. Come on, let's have a look. And ignoring the large out of order sign, she opened the door. Hermione put her fingers to her lips and set off toward the end stall. When she reached it, she said, Hello, Myrtle, how are you? Hermione flinched. She hoped Myrtle had forgiven her from the Death Day party. Harry and Ron came closer to look. Myrtle was floating above the tank of the toilet, picking a spot on her chin. This is a girl's bathroom, she said, eyeing Ron and Harry suspiciously. They're not girls. No, Hermione agreed. I just wanted to show them how nice it is in here. She waved vaguely at the dirty old mirror and the damp floor. Maybe she was overselling it. Ask her if she saw anything, Harry mouthed at Hermione. What are you whispering? Said Myrtle, staring at him. Nothing, said Harry quickly. We wanted to ask. I wish people would stop talking behind my back, said Myrtle in a voice choked with tears. I do have feelings, you know, even if I'm dead. Myrtle, no one wants to upset you, said Hermione. Harry only. No one wants to upset me. That's a good one, howled Myrtle. My life was nothing but misery in this place, and now people come along ruining my death. We wanted to ask you if you've seen anything funny lately, said Hermione quickly, because a cat was attacked right outside your front door on Halloween. Did you see anyone near here that night? Said Harry. I wasn't paying attention, said Myrtle dramatically. Peeves upset me so much I came in here and tried to kill myself. Then, of course, I remember that I'm already dead, said Ron helpfully. Hermione groaned. If there was any subject not to talk to Myrtle about, it was most assuredly that one. Myrtle gave a tragic sob, rose in the air, turned over, and dived headfirst into the toilet, splashing hot water all over them and vanishing from sight, although from the direction of her muffled sobs she had come to rest somewhere in the U-bend. Harry and Ron stood with their mouths open, but Hermione shrugged wearily and said, Honestly, that was almost cheerful for Myrtle. Come on, let's go. Harry had barely closed the door on Myrtle's gurgling sobs when a loud voice made all three of them jump. Ron! Percy Weasley had stopped dead at the head of the stairs, prefect badge agleam, an expression of complete shock on his face. That's a girl's bathroom, he gasped. What were you? Just having a look around, Ron shrugged. Clues, you know. Get away from there, Percy said, striding towards them and starting to bustle them along, flapping his arms. Don't you care what this looks like? Coming back here while everyone's at dinner? Suddenly, Hermione understood why Percy was so angry. Why shouldn't we be here? Said Ron hotly, stopping short and glaring at Percy. Listen, we never laid a finger on that cat. That's what I told Ginny, said Percy fiercely. But she still seems to think you're going to be expelled. I've never seen her so upset, crying her eyes out. You might think of her. All the first years are thoroughly overexcited by this business. Hermione gasped. She didn't think Ginny was that upset. And expelled? You don't care about Ginny, said Ron, whose ears were now reddening. You just worry that I'm going to mess up your chances of being head boy. 5 points from Gryffindor, Percy said tersely, fingering his prefect badge. And I hope it teaches you a lesson. No more detective work or I'll write Mom. And he strode off. Hermione noticed the back of his neck was as red as Ron's ears. Harry, Ron, and Hermione chose seats as far as possible from Percy in the common room that night. Ron was still in a terrible mood and kept blotting his charms homework. When he reached absently for his wand, to remove the smudges, it ignited a parchment. Fuming almost as much as his homework, Ron slammed the standard book of spells grade 2 shut. Hermione did the same. She just had to talk through the thoughts racing through her head. Who can it be, though? She said in a quiet voice. Who'd want to frighten all the squeebs and muggle-borns out of Hogwarts? Let's think, said Ron in mock puzzlement. Who do we know who thinks muggle-borns are scum? He looked at Hermione. Hermione looked back, unconvinced. If you're talking about Malfoy, of course I am, said Ron. You heard him. You'll be next, mudbloods. Come on. You've only got to look at his foul rat face to know it's him. Malfoy, the heir of Slytherin. said Hermione skeptically. She knew he was an awful human being, but the heir of Slytherin. She'd hate to give him that much credit. Look at his family, said Harry, closing his books too. A whole lot of them have been in Slytherin. He's always boasting about it. They could easily be Slytherin's descendants. His father's definitely evil, though. They could have had the key to the Chamber of Secrets for centuries, said Ron, handing it down father to son. Well, said Hermione cautiously, her mind following the boys at record speed. I suppose it's possible. But how do we prove it? Said Harry darkly. Hermione took a few seconds to make sense of the lightning storm of thoughts in her head. There might be a way, said Hermione slowly, forming the plan as she spoke. She dropped her voice still further with a quick glance across the room at Percy. Of course it would be difficult and dangerous, very dangerous. We'd be breaking about 50 school rules, I expect. If in a month or so you feel like explaining, you'll let us know, won't you? Said Ron irritably. Hermione silenced him with a look and continued. All right, said Hermione coldly. What we need to do is to get inside the Slytherin common room and ask Malfoy a few questions without him realizing it's us. But that's impossible, Harry said as Ron laughed. No, it's not, said Hermione sternly. All we'd need would be some Polyjuice potion. What's that? Said Ron and Harry together. Hermione rolled her eyes. If she weren't so nervous about breaking so many rules, she'd probably have called them out on their oversight. Snape mentioned it in class a few weeks ago. You think we've got nothing better to do in potions than listen to Snape? Murmured Ron. Hermione ignored him. It transforms you into somebody else. Think about it, Hermione said, making a concerted effort to turn her growing anxiety into excitement to try such advanced magic. We could change into 3 of the Slytherins. No one would know it was us. Malfoy would probably tell us anything. He's probably boasting about it in the Slytherin room right now. If only we could hear him. This Polyjuice stuff sounds a bit dodgy to me, said Ron, frowning. What if we were stuck looking like 3 of the Slytherins forever? It wears off after a while, said Hermione, waving her hand impatiently. But getting hold of the recipe will be very difficult. Snape said it was in a book called Most Potent Potions, and it's bound to be in the restricted section of the library. There was only one way to get out of book from the restricted section. You needed a signed note of permission from a teacher. Hard to see why we'd want the book, really, said Ron, if we weren't going to try and make one of the potions. I think, said Hermione, that if we make it sound as though we were just interested in the theory, we might stand a chance. Oh, come on. No teacher's going to fall for that, said Ron. They'd have to be really thick. Ron was right. All of the professors were brilliant. There would be no way.